Trafficking is a modern form of slavery. There are two forms of trafficking. One is labor trafficking, and the other is sex trafficking. Essentially, what trafficking means and conveys is, in our global modern world, the movement of people for the purposes of holding them in a situation in which they are forced to either perform sex acts or to work against their will. And we see trafficking occurring in all types of industries, not just in sex work, but in various forms of labor, essentially.
I define trafficking as a form of unfree labor. And so, at least doctrinally in the United States, our jurisprudence around unfree labor, I would say, began with the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And at the time, it abolished a certain kind of slavery, chattel slavery. But subsequent to the 13th Amendment passage, there were new manifestations of unfree labor, including peonage, debt bondage, involuntary servitude, and the most contemporary manifestation is human trafficking.
So there's all different sort of categories of people who get trafficked in the country. I think the most sort of prominent that you hear about is sex trafficking, and sex trafficking involving minors often, who come into the country and are forced to work as sex laborers. But it's certainly not limited to that, to sex trafficking, and that may not even be a majority or even the biggest percentage of folks who are trafficked in. I think you see it in almost all sectors of the economy where you see other low-wage workers. So it happens in farming communities. A lot of people end up getting trafficked in domestic work, which is where I have my own experience doing trafficking cases. Even in restaurants, pretty much anywhere where you're going to see low-wage workers, there's the opportunity there for people to be trafficked in and their labor to be used in that way.
The traffickers are also a diverse range of individuals and organizations. The traffickers could be a large criminal network, although those are probably fewer cases than cases involving smaller networks of criminals or even legitimate businesses that are both larger corporations as well as mom and pop establishments. And finally, individuals can traffic other individuals, and which would occur in a typical domestic worker case involving an individual private home that's employed by one or two and other traffickers, individuals.
In the cases I worked on, it happened to be just individual families who had some connection to people in their home country, and then through those connections managed to locate someone and bring them, help arrange for their travel to the United States, and then enslave them when they were here.
Yeah, I think particularly in the circumstances of people who are already in the United States, when a person lacks immigration status, it creates another factor that makes them subject to various forms of coercion on the basis of that, because a person will feel that because of their tenuous immigration status, that they can't go to the police authorities because they might be deported. And this is something that someone who intends to keep a person in a form of sort of forced labor or sexual servitude will use their immigration status against them as a threat to keep them in a situation of servitude. And so that's how we see immigration status particularly playing out in trafficking in the United States.
I think there are sort of in the public at large, just in the sense that I think when people think of trafficking, they think of the typical victim being like a young woman, often trafficked for sex trafficking purposes, and people don't sort of think about the full range of types of trafficking that are out there. There are plenty of men who are trafficked into the country as well to work in all sorts of different areas. And then even for women, you know, the trafficking victims are not, definitely not solely limited to doing sex trafficking work. As I mentioned, you know, people can end up in doing domestic work, they can end up working in a restaurant, on a farm, whatever it may be. So I think people's sort of vision of what a trafficking victim looks like doesn't really capture the whole range of victims that are out there.
I think in some ways there's more work to be done by non-attorneys, especially in the rehabilitation of victims and working with them to both obtain social services, the benefits that are available to them, and the kind of emotional and psychological assistance that they need. So, I think that rehabilitative work is really, really vital, and is really integral to the humanitarian aspect of our country's commitment to serve victims of trafficking. So lots of work for social workers and for mental health workers particularly, yeah.